For our first film brief, we were given the title All the Time in the World, and we were asked to focus on non verbal world building as well as only being allowed 6 lines of dialogue. When discussing our ideas for the film, me and Solly had a few possibilities that we were bouncing off each other, and it was clear that rather than answer the brief with something exploring all the time in the world directly, I think it was clear we wanted to do something surrounding how someone spends their time wisely. So, as Solly had past experiences in hospital with lots of time to spare, we decided something along these lines would be a good angle. This elderly gentleman has just been put into a home by his daughter and is feeling angry by said action. However, upon rummaging through a box of activities his daughter has left, he realises his true passion is for painting, and even though he now has all the time in the world, he now has a productive, beneficial way to fill that time. There are a few films that address the subject of all the time in the world, and for most it's portrayed in a more negative way, and is about how to overcome, like our character, how to spend your time most wisely. There's a few examples that ironically take place in space. For instance, Matt Damon's character in Ridley Scott's The Martian is faced with the seemingly impossible task of simply staying alive by keeping yourself sane, whilst isolated from all other forms of existence. However, the most prominent example is from the film Click, directed by Frank Coraci. In this film, Adam Sandler's character is given a remote that literally can grant him all the time in the world, to the point where he can pick and choose the best bits of his entire life and skip that which he is uninterested in. But he eventually learns how detrimental these actions will be towards his happiness, and has to overcome his own stupidity and figure out what he truly cares for. I believe a lot of the morals expressed are similar to what we were trying to get through in our film. The hardest thing about this film was keeping within the 6 lines of dialogue restriction, and had to build the world around us in order to fill in the blanks that dialogue wasn't allowed to. There was one slight cultural consideration that came to mind, which was the fact that it is quite common in our culture to put our parents into a retirement home once they reach a certain age, as it might be harder to care for them along with the rest of life's tasks. Whereas elsewhere, such as in certain Asian culture, it is a lot more common for elderly parents to move in with their children. I think this would have more greatly resonated with our audience had they had been of an older generation, however could still apply to third generation people whose grandparents either live with them at home or in a retirement home. A storytelling theory that could be applied to our film would be one similar to Todorov's narrative theory. This is a very popular form of telling stories through film and has been for a long time. The only difference between this theory and the way we told our story is that according to Todorov, the story starts with a state of equilibrium and then moves on to disruption of that equilibrium. With our film, as we had only a matter of minutes, we jumped straight into the disruption of the equilibrium, being illustrated by the fact that our main character, Bernard, is upset about being put into a retirement home. This step in the theory is pretty much fused with the following step of recognition of the disruption, which is then followed by an attempt at repairing the damage, illustrated by a box of activities left by Bernard's daughter Jane in order to keep him occupied. The final stage of this theory is the new equilibrium, which is met with when the retired man reaches happiness by finding a new way for him to express himself and spend his time doing something he truly enjoys. One thing I wanted to communicate in the story was our main character's isolation at this new situation he had found himself in. I wanted to be able to tell a lot of the story through his emotional state, and one suggestion I had would be through a cinematographic technique. I realised these decisions are more likely to be decided on the shoot day, but I suggested in the script to try and isolate Bernard by including wide shots of him alone in the room. I thought that it would be best to keep Bernard's dialogue to a minimum and use them on his daughter Jane and the nurse, not only as an effort to explain our story more effectively, but to further this theme of Bernard's isolation and discontent. I also stepped in as soundman on the day, which was good, as me and Solly had discussed how we thought it would be a good idea to include different tedious and dull sounds to combine with the sound of a ticking clock, which reminds our audience of the theme of time, and also as a way of introducing this sense of monotony in Bernard's new surroundings and the possibility of him getting sucked further into this negative mental state. I believe how we built the world around Bernard and his mental state with the use of certain props was well done, for instance with the TV, cup of tea and clock, and I liked how these props used to suggest monotony and general negativity in a way mirror the props brought in by Jane to further Bernard's ascent into positive thinking. Having said this, I was disappointed in the fact that the motif of the ticking clock was not added to the film. I believe this would have really been the icing on the cake and would have really boosted the audience's view of what we wanted to get across. I also think that my script could have been improved, as when I was given the feedback that the line in which Jane says, "finish the paperwork," was lazy screenwriting. I added this as an attempt to maybe add to the understanding of the narrative, but in hindsight, I think people understood the situation already, and I could have just used the "pick up the kids from school" line on its own. Originally, the plan was to have the main character as a young person in hospital, but when we thought logistically of how to pull this off, a hospital bed would be extremely hard to come by. We considered using the young person's character all the same, but just in a bed at home, however decided not to do this. I think the idea of shooting it in a bedroom would have been a good one, as it would have allowed our audience a greater chance to relate to our story because although they might not have experienced being bedridden before, if the character is of a similar age to them, it will automatically be easier for them to understand and sympathise with the character. From this film, I learned that it's not only easier to tell the story through visual world building techniques, but also more effective. And I think in the future I will save the dialogue more so for the development of the characters and the audience's understanding of them. To conclude, I think there are definitely a few things that could have been improved on, but I do think credit is due towards our intentions and much of how it was pulled off. I think I could have maybe attempted at world building more effectively and maybe shot some seeds outside of the room had we been allowed to, but on the other hand, I do think we got across what we intended to. For our second film, we decided to take a slightly different approach and adopted the model of a mockumentary, which came about when Fanny and Matilde suggested it to our group and Solly had expressed interest in comedy. There was next to no restriction put in place for this film, so it was a chance for me to really expand on my screenwriting experience. Our story was designed to express the fictional opinions on Brexit from the point of view of three different characters. One film that inspired our decision to film a mockumentary was What We Do in the Shadows by Taika Waititi. This revolutionary vampire story combines their traditional concept with typical modern day life and offers up an incredible opportunity for refreshing comedy. Making our idea into a story would be a bit harder than usual as, to a certain extent, we were trying to pass this off as real life and so had to include documentary style, which rarely takes on a traditional narrative approach, but similarly with the first film I tried to incorporate a disruption and resolution approach. Again, for this film I was in charge of writing the script, and I wanted to communicate comical but fairly realistic opinions. I realised that we had to make these characters funny, not through doing specifically funny artificial actions, but simply through the authenticity of their character, whilst also trying to snatch at the opportunity to communicate a political and social message. For instance, the fact that Dan's character is concerned that loads of foreigners are coming to the UK and taking all the jobs, when in reality he doesn't put any effort into finding employment. I feel like through researching interviews, a lot of people do think that this is the case, when in actual fact employment of foreign people contributes greatly to our economy. I really like our characters and thought that our actor's execution was very good, especially Sam, who was our main character. As much as I thought my script was good and worked for the story we were telling, I also thought that to add a realistic feel to the characters, they had to act in their own way, how they felt comfortable, and to improvise using my script as a basis. One thing I didn't like was the fact that I had to step in as an actor on the day due to our kebab shop owner deciding at very short notice that he wasn't going to work with us. The fact that I was in it, I feel like could be quite distracting as we were trying to appear as realistic as possible, and I think people in the audience knew I wasn't a kebab shop owner's son. I would definitely like to evolve this idea, as I think there is a huge opportunity for an amazing piece of work here. If we could maybe work on this without any restrictions whatsoever, for example the 5-minute limit, I think we could improve certain aspects. I think our intentions of the way the story unfolded was due to be very effective, however I think the proportions of the different parts of the film were wrong, and if in the future we continue this idea, I would make the payoff at the end more satisfying by building it up more in the middle of the film. In future I would like to work with the actors a lot beforehand, so they feel as comfortable as possible delivering their performance, overall making our film as realistic as possible. I enjoyed trying to create the realistic dialogue through our film and thought that I did a decent job of making it benefit our story. I do believe that I can take what I've learned from the production of this film and apply it to my future work. One piece of criticism I would give is that I don't think it was culturally prominent as it could have been. I feel that we focused more so on the comedy side of things as well as keeping within a traditional story structure, but had lots more room for deeper message. I really enjoyed working on this film, and although there are a few things we could have done differently, I highly admire our ambition, as I do believe we were the first group to attempt a mockumentary since the start of the course, and I'm certain that people watching this will be inspired to make mockumentaries of their own.